Hi, it's Lili. Today I would like to share with you how I made this sculpture out of solid copper bars that I found at the scrapyard. I'm going to show you the whole process step by step. I'm also going to share with you some experiments that I've done with the patina. Now, I've hesitated to call this video "What can possibly go wrong when you work with solid copper?" Turn out plenty of things. But I believe there's as much value in sharing what can go wrong and how to fix it that just when a whole project goes smoothly. Now, I would like to say a special thanks to Natalie, my teacher, who helped me out when things went wrong and calmed me down when I was freaking out. So, Natalie, you're the best. Thank you. Now, let's get started with this project. So now I have my solid bar of copper, roughly 20mm wide. I have my tongs, which have a really nice tight grip. That is crucial to have full control of my bar, especially when it's well hot. I have a heavy hammer and some wire brush or block brush. I set up my copper bar next to the fire to warm it up. Make sure I have plenty of coal and that the fire is going nicely. And then I place my bar into the fire, waiting for it to get to the right temperature. Get it out of the fire, remove the scale, and start some blacksmithing. So the first thing I wanted to do is some drawing. Now, if you're an experienced blacksmith looking at this video, don't judge me too harshly. I'm a beginner and we all need to start somewhere. So here's me playing around with my bar, try to stretch it and to get the end thinner and thinner. Now, I like to work with copper because it's so soft, but at the same time it can go wrong really quickly. And as you can see on the edge of my bar here, it's burned because I let it in the fire just a bit too long. But that's it, like, you know what, that's fixable. Once I was happy with my lengths, I start to work on the edges to slowly round it up my bar, hammer all the edges down. It took a lot of back and forth between the fire and the anvil, but I was quite happy with that. So far it was looking good. It started to get more and more rounded. I took my time to round up section by section, make sure it was nice and smooth. I was happy so far. At that stage, I still have hopes and dreams, but if I've learned something with copper, it's that it can go wrong very, very quickly. You want to see things going wrong? All right, in 3, 2, 1, ta-da! Yes, you may have noticed that a quarter of my length is gone. Literally, I just leave it a few seconds too many in the fire and it decided to separate. So, good thing I'm not sharing the audio of that recording because I was swearing substantially at that stage. It was just so frustrating. So as you can see, the little bar there who decided to stay in the fire probably was nice and cozy in there. Now, the good thing with blacksmithing is when you're pissed off, you can just unleash your anger and hammer the hell out of the next piece of metal. And I can tell you that I did so. Now, at that stage, I start to create my little curve and play around with my anvil. I didn't want something too regular and control. I wanted to have something that curled on the side. And also, let's be honest, I'm still a newbie, so I'm still figuring out how on earth to get the right curve that I want. So I've been playing back and forth between the fire and the anvil, try to get some interesting shapes, figure out as well which tongs I need to hold in different position the piece of copper to get the shape I wanted. Now, since I have my little tentacle that I decided to separate, I thought might as well do something with it. That's where I decided to go for a composition of 3 tentacles. It wasn't exactly the plan to begin with, but you know what, things do go wrong in a workshop and in life in general, and adaptation is the best strategy. I've put both my tentacles next to each other and started to understand, okay, what next can I create to bring something extra to it? At that stage, I was covered in sweat anyway. I've done my morning routine and I thought might as well just keep going. So luckily for me, I have another solid bar of copper that I can work with. And I start to do the whole thing over again. Don't worry, I'm not going to get you the full footage, but basically, yeah, get back into the forge, right temperature, remove the scale, and hammer it until I have an interesting shape. I position my 3 tentacles on a table and try to understand how they can work with each other with the shape. Once I was kind of happy with it, I quenched the 3rd tentacles in water so I can cut it to size roughly and get a better understanding of how they're gonna work with the composition. Finally quench it. And then I start to work on the base. So I need to have them sitting nicely and flush on the table. So I use a marker pen and I marked up where exactly they were sitting and how much I need to remove. Then I use my disc cutter, cut it out, and I went back and forth quite a few times to make sure I had a nice fit. Now, before doing any kind of cutting and grinding, I always make sure I have the ear protection, eye protection, and respirator with the filters. I've started cleaning it up with a flap disc first, and then I use a blender from Vortex. This is really nice with copper to soften the whole thing up. And I went around the whole thing to remove the mark from the previous disc. It was hard to get in the small areas, so using my Dremel and some sanding drums were really handy to achieve that and to get in there. Now I wanted to weld those pieces together, and I didn't want to weld them to the table. So I used an aluminium plate because I knew it would not completely bond to it, and I placed it underneath the tentacles. Before doing any welding with copper, because the fumes are really toxic, I always have my respirators on with the filters. Before tackling the main piece, I always do some tests, and the good thing I had some leftover of this bar to play around with. In terms of the rod I've used is 100% pure copper. I quickly realized that because the copper was quite thick, it was absorbing so much heat and conducting it throughout the whole mass. So I had to put my torch way up, and it turned out to be much more difficult than usual because it was absorbing everything. I need to feed up more and more heat. It took a while and it was more messy than what I wished for, but anyway, here's the result. I could remove it from the aluminium plate. Look a bit of a mess, but that's fixable. At that stage, I'm just happy they hold together. So I've done obviously some cleaning and get the burr in there with the Dremel, which looks much better already, but it needs way more cleaning than that. Then I start focusing on the base plates. I took a piece of paper, make a rough sketch on it, fold it in half, cut it with a scissor, reopen it, put my sculpture on top of it, and then readjust. So I fold it back, cut it again, and make sure I have a really nice shape. Once I was happy with that shape, I copy my template onto a piece of 1.2 mil thick copper sheet, permanent marker, and then I cut it. You can use a plasma cutter, you can cut it by hand. I use a jigsaw with a metal blade. Now, if you have a very basic jigsaw, you might not be able to manage metal because you need to have a really strong, heavy-duty jigsaw and one ideally where you can adjust the speed. I've used the flap disc to smooth things up, and I switched to my blender to smooth them even more. And finally, a bit of a Scotch-Brite to smooth the top. I wanted to weld it to the plate, and this is where things went seriously wrong, because I didn't realize that by now my 3 tentacles were working as a whole mass of copper. Every time I was bringing the torch, the heat was traveling to the whole mass, and it took forever. I mean, I spent ages in there, the torch to the max, I've blew the fuse, it just wasn't working well. It was such a fight and it was such a mess. It just wasn't working as I thought because I was working with solid copper. So you know what, I have to admit it wasn't working out. I need to rethink my strategy. So let's get the Dremel, let's get the cutting wheel, remove it from the plate and clean the whole thing up. Now, I went back to more cleanup with the burr. I also decided to sand the back to make sure I have a much flatter and stable base, as you can see here. I also have a little bit of a gap and I knew I needed to fill that up, but it was standing flat more nicely now. So more cleanup with Scotch-Brite, with my Dremel, with lots of little bits until it start to look a bit better. Okay, so now I start to move the tentacles. First, I mark them up with a marker pen. Then I start to play with my leftover, and it was a nightmare because once again the heat was traveling and feeding through the whole bar, and it was hard to heat it up to the right temperature. For some reason, the rod, even though it was 100% copper, it didn't really work well for this application. So instead of working with the 100% copper, I actually turned to another alternative with a copper phosphorus solder, and for some reason this worked a bit better. So I've done some tests. It was not great, but it was better than before. Also, I was able to put maybe 4 or 5 dots, and by then the heat has traveled so much and the whole bar was extremely hot that every point I was putting on was melting straight away. So I realized I need to go back and forth quenching all the time just to be able to manage the heat of the copper mass. I've tried out drilling a little bit my holes to try to have more control of where the suckers end up, and it kind of helped. So I've done some tests on the main leftover and I was happier with it. It was not great, but you know what? It was something, and I knew I can work with that. So I started drilling the whole piece. Also because I was working against gravity, every time you have the slightest slope, it will run off. So it was extremely frustrating experience because in this design, I have nothing but slopes. It's always running away in one direction or another. So I started my first few suckers. It wasn't exactly a great success. And I had to move around and take all the piece of solid metal that I can find just to lift the sculpture in a position where the sucker I was trying to put in was kind of flat. So I always have to re-level and reposition those bars just to be able to alter the position of my sculpture just to get in there. And after 5 or 6 dots, I had to change tentacles. The heat was still traveling, but not as fast. So the other tentacles were slightly colder, and that allowed me to work on those as well. But I have to get back and forth with quenching regularly just to get the temperature under control. And it was painstakingly long, it was frustrating, it was difficult. I suddenly wished I'd done this in steel because this job would have been done so quickly, but copper as a mass, as I was working with here, just gave me a different response. I had to be very patient. It took lots of cleaning to see what I was dealing with. Now, because I'm using a rod that is not 100% copper, you have a different shade, which is nice in contrast, but it shows. So I have much more cleanup. So much cleaning with this thing, back and forth with the burr, with the abrasive wheels, and then more welding. And then I decide to burr the little suckers out. I couldn't face the risk of having the torch coming towards those suckers that I spent ages getting them on. It will have melted straight away and we'll have to start from scratch. So actually using the Dremel and burr them out, in my case, was the best solution forward. And it took so much more cleaning, never-ending cleaning this thing. But it started to come together and that was a relief. Now and back to my base plate, it was a bit of a mess, but that was fixable. So I had to use my flap disc first, clean it up. When it comes to the attachment, one way of doing it would have been to drill some holes and then weld it from the back. But once again, I couldn't face the risk of having the whole piece heating up to a point that all my suckers will melt. So like, no, plan B. I took a piece of paper, copy the shape of my plate on it, position my sculpture onto it, mark up exactly where the base of the sculpture was. I also marked up where the mass of the 2 main tentacles on each side were because I had to drill into it. I wanted to make sure exactly of where my screws were going. I've used a punch and a hammer my 2 points into the copper. Then I position onto 2 bars and drill them up. I cut out my paper template, position back onto the copper sheet. Then I was able to position back my sculpture, holding very tightly, flip it, and mark those 2 holes at the back of my sculpture with a marker. Now, I use the punch again, mark the holes. I started to create some kind of cushion with some gloves and blocks of metal, drill them up, and then I wanted to create a thread inside of those holes using the thread tapping tool, and it's a very delicate operation because those can snap. So I very gently put the first one and it was going really nicely in there and I was like so happy my first one was done. And then what can possibly go wrong? Well, for the second one is snap. And it snapped and broke into the hole. And as you can see, I had just tiny bits coming out of it. I mean, what else can go wrong? Honestly, it was just frustrating. So anyway, I was trying to get this little piece of the threading tool out and it didn't want to come out. I was fighting with it back and forth, and after a while it was just a mess. It was a big hole. So the strategy needed to be rethink. Anyway, I decided to distract myself and cut a piece of copper out of 0.9 mil sheet, bend it and drill it. As you can see here, it's not pretty, but it will do the job. I mark up the central line for the weight distribution and try to line up the hole at the back of my little homemade plate onto it, hold it, reverse it, and mark up exactly where those holes were. Then I punch it, drill it, and make sure they line up nicely. So now I have my sculpture, my base plate, my little top hats, and then I have the screws that I had to cut down to the right size. So On the left side, it was going nicely with thread. On the other side, it was a mess and it needed some glue. So I used the epoxy glue, the Gorilla brand, mix it up, carefully position it onto the massive holes that I dig for myself. Then position the plates back onto it carefully. Get the screws, make sure the one screw on the left is really nice and tight, and let the other one set in the epoxy glue. So there was tons of cleanup still needed, but in the meantime I thought, okay, let's play around and do some tests. I fill up a little container with some ammonia and use some leftover of copper, the one I've used to test my well, for example, as well as some leftover pieces, and I position them inside of a Tupperware. I use some paper towel with plenty of salt onto it, and I soak them with some ammonia, and I place it all around my copper. So I've done my little tests. One of them have some vinegar as well. I thought, okay, let's see if that works a bit better. I let them soak for a few hours and then I have a look, and I had some nice blue. I was quite happy with it and quite excited. I let them dry out. I've noticed that the one that has vinegar seems to have slightly more blue. So I thought, okay, let's incorporate that. So now I started the whole process again, starting with acetone, which is very important to clean up the whole sculpture. I'm sorry that the footage is a bit out of focus. I put gloves on, paper towel, soaked in acetone, and I spent some time going around every single bits of my sculpture, make sure it was fully clean. Then I use a spray bottle with some vinegar in it, spray all around it, add a bit of salt. Then the main ingredient, ammonia. This stuff stinks like hell. You need to have a respirator and some eye protection, otherwise you'll be begging for some within seconds. This is horrible. Anyway, I was outside obviously for ventilation. I filled up another container on top of the previous container I've already filled. As you can see, I've got a little button to just make sure my sculpture is lifted from where the containers are. Then I soaked up 2 paper towels at a time with some ammonia, and then I start to crunch it, whatever you want to call this effect here. Then spread plenty of salt onto it, and then I was reversing it onto the sculpture. And because of the way I folded the paper towel, I was able to go all around my sculpture and be able to wrap every single tentacles and make sure they all have contact with the paper towel soaked in ammonia. Now you can see it better, all wrapped up in those towels, and within minutes you can see the blue starting to come up, so that's exciting. I wanted to close my Tupperware, but because it was so tall, I had to actually use another Tupperware and use duct tape to attach them together. And I leave it for a while. After 6 hours, I wanted to have a peek, see how much it transformed, and I can see quite a strong effect already. The tentacles were really nice and blue, but on the bottom, we'll see on the plate, it seems like where the tissue were touching the plate, the transformation hasn't happened yet. So I thought, okay, I'm going to put back the tissue, but above it, almost like a little tent, try to not touch the base plate and see how it's going to respond. This is how it looks after 24 hours in total, and you can see the color is just gorgeous. You can still see on the edges here where the soaked tissue were touching that the copper hasn't transformed as much as the rest, and I was just so pleased with it. So I just decided to sand slightly the top of the suckers to create a little bit of contrast and having the copper coming through. I've ordered this new lacquer on Amazon. I've done a little test on the small tentacles, the test bits on the side, to see if it's working fine, no problem. So I started spraying the whole thing. And at that stage, I wasn't even thinking what can possibly go wrong. It was literally the last step of my sculpture. Now, could you imagine the feeling I had when an hour later I came to pick up my final pieces all dried up and I saw this? Oh dear, oh dear. And it was not even just one point with this kind of white stain that I can fix. I tried to remove it very gently with a Scotch-Brite, but it was attacking the patina and removing it underneath, or it was literally stuck between the suckers, and it was just so frustrating. At that stage, I didn't really see how I can fix that, so unfortunately I had to go back to my workshop, spend another hour sanding the whole thing down as much as I can. Because my sculpture was attached to my base plate, I wasn't able to get underneath, so I wasn't able to clean it as much, and I could see that the texture of the copper has been altered by the patina as well. So I I start the whole process again, clean up the whole thing with acetone, reuse the leftover of ammonia that I've put in the bottle from the previous batch, spray with vinegar, add a little bit of salt, and then soak some paper towel with the leftover of ammonia I had in the bottle, sprinkle a little bit of salt, and then position it above it. So overall, I didn't have as much ammonia as the previous batch, but I thought I'm gonna give it a shot, cover it with the Tupperware and duct tape. Now, I had a little peek after, I think it was 6 or 8 hours. It was well dark already. I can see the transformation. I've got some nice blue. I was concerned about the salt staying on the base plates, so I thought, okay, I'm gonna brush it off or even just wash it off with the ammonia at some point. Why not? Let's just soak the whole thing with ammonia and see how it's gonna turn out. I put back what was left of my paper towel, tried to create a little tent and not have the paper towel directly against the base plate. So this is what it looked like after a total of 24 hours. And I was concerned about the ammonia staying on the plate. So what I did is use some water in a spray bottle, spray it over it and remove it quickly with the paper towel to remove the damp as much as possible. So I sent down a little bit the sucker once again to create some contrast and highlight. I went back to the spray that I used previously, Rust-Oleum Crystal Clear, which I know works and doesn't create white stain. And I gently sprayed over it, let it dry for an hour and add another coat. Now it reacted really differently than the previous batch. It went way darker. That's also the effect of a sealer. I knew it will make everything dark, but it still has some lovely, gorgeous effect out of it. So it was worth the experiment overall. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've got other projects coming up, so I hope you will enjoy them too. Take care. Bye bye.